Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on behalf of Digital, the Mill Site Committee, and the Mill Clock Centennial Committee to the 100th birthday celebration, the Centennial, of the Mill Clock. My name's Jack McKean, and as a Maynard resident, I will be your host for this evening. What I'd like to do first is recognize our speakers. It is a little bit difficult if you're not familiar with these seats to sort of pop up and really stand up and be recognized. But what I would like to do is I call their name, perhaps since they're down front, just raise a hand so folks in the audience will know where you are. First, State Senator Robert Durand, over here. Ken DeMars, Chairman of the Board of Selectmen, there. Elizabeth Schneer, member of the Maynard Historical Commission and the Maynard Historical Society. Ralph Sheridan, who needs no introduction, our town historian. And finally, our lecturer this evening, Mr. Dana Blackwell, former curator of the American Clock and Watch Museum. Now, before we get going, perhaps we could have the house lights up if that's not too much trouble, because there are a few other folks that I think we should recognize this evening. We've spoken about Ken DeMars, but other members of the Board of Selectmen are here as well. Perhaps they could raise their hand as well. Robert Gilligan, Frank Ignachuk, Dick Downey. From Digital Equipment Corporation, a Senior Vice President, Mr. Win Hindle. Mike Gianotis, the Town Administrator, up there in the back. And Fire Chief Ron Cassidy, who with his department helped, and I hope that you've noticed as you've come in and out of the building, the bunting which is up on the clock tower, and we owe a vote of thanks to the fire department for helping with that. Alice Hanson, who authored the poem, there she is, that is in your program. And finally, Paul Cheney. Now that's a name that is perhaps not well recognized, but Paul is the grandson of Levi Cheney, builder of the clock tower, literally who built the clock tower that contains the clock that we're honoring tonight. Mr. Cheney is visiting us from the Cape along with several of his family members, and we would particularly like to thank him because if you go down in the lobby area, you'll notice a number of the items in the historical display that was organized with his help, and we would really like to express our appreciation to Mr. Cheney. Now, at this moment, I am pleased to introduce Senator Bob Durand, a good friend of Digital who has taken great interest not only in the mill but in the Assabet, the Assabet River, which once powered the mill. And while I know that he has things he would like to talk about because I got a flyer at home from him last night, his purpose this evening is to present to us greetings from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Senator Durand, please.
Thank you, Jack. I'm here on behalf of Governor Bill Well, Lieutenant Governor Paul Salusi, State Representative Hasty Evans, and myself. Before I present the proclamation, let me say that 2 weeks ago, I was at the groundbreaking of Fab 6 over in the town of Hudson. It's great to see Digital continuing to grow, continuing to prosper in this area. It's great for our economy, and it's certainly great for the company as a whole. It's nice to remember that even though we're experiencing tough economic times right now, that we don't lose the importance of historic preservation. And today's ceremony is another indication of Digital's resolve to play a major part in the community, this community of Maynard, to preserve something that will be a beacon for future generations so that other generations of Americans and people who live here in the town of Maynard can look back on this celebration 25, 50 years from now and remember the experiences and the things that Digital has given to the town of Maynard. The type of economic development, jobs, and growth which has been so important to this area. And as we did the groundbreaking at Fab 6, they put a time capsule in the ground, and maybe it's not too late, but certainly the mill clock, I'm sure, will play a prominent place in that groundbreaking. With that, I have three proclamations, and I'm not going to read all three. I'll just read the one from the governor, and we'll call it that. Be it known to all that the Massachusetts State Legislature and the Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts hereby extends its congratulations Digital Equipment Corporation in recognition of the Centennial anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the mill clock at Digital Corporate Headquarters in Maynard. And be it further known that the Massachusetts Legislature and the Governor's Office extends its best wishes for continued success, that this citation be duly signed by the Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Governor Bill Weld. Congratulations.
Thank you, Senator Durand. I think it's clear that we at Digital have always taken great pride in our relationship with the town of Maynard. A number of years ago, there was a ceremony locally honoring Ken, and it's one of the things that he still talks about when you talk to him privately, the honoring of Ken Olson by the town of Maynard. And it therefore gives me great pleasure to see so many residents, so many of the town officials here tonight, and to welcome in particular the chairman of the Maynard Board of Selectmen, Kenneth DeMars. Ken?
Thank you, Jack. On behalf of the town of Maynard and the Board of Selectmen, we're very pleased to be here tonight to honor the clock and its 100th anniversary. I have here an official proclamation from the town of Maynard. Whereas the mill clock was given to the Assabet Manufacturing Company in 1892 by Lorenzo Maynard, son of Amory Maynard. Whereas the clock tower was made by the E. Howard Clock Company of Waltham and built by well-known Maynard resident Levi Cheney. And whereas the town of Maynard in 1975 recognized the historical significance of the mill clock by adopting it as its new town seal by vote of town meeting. And whereas Digital Equipment Corporation, through the civic mindedness and pride of its executions, completely renovated the clock and its tower, thus preserving this historical landmark in 1980. And whereas today we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the mill clock and cherish its service to the town as both a historical landmark and functional timepiece. Now, therefore, we, the Maynard Board of Selectmen, do hereby proclaim Wednesday, October 21, 1992, as Maynard Mill Clock Day in the town of Maynard, and hereby recognize Digital Equipment Corporation for its efforts to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the clock tower, given in the Selectmen's Chambers this 19th day of October in the year of our Lord, 1992. Signed by the Maynard Board of Selectmen, Kenneth R. DeMars, Chairman, George B. Shaw, Frank Ignachuk, Robert P. Gilligan, and Richard Downey. Thank you.
Thank you not only to Ken, but to all of the members of the Board of Selectmen. It is indeed a tribute, and we accept it in the spirit in which it was given. Many of you in the room, I'm sure, I'm certain, I'm not sure, Elizabeth Schneer, as proprietor of Schneer's Newsstand on Main Street, a very familiar face. She lives and works in Maynard. An active member of the Maynard Historical Society and the Maynard Historical Commission. We're pleased that she is here tonight to share with us something she calls a timely talk. Ms. Schneer, please.
Good evening. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of an autobiography. I am a third-generation Maynardite. I've been working across the street here for more years than I'm going to tell you about, and this is only my second visit to the mill in all those years. This is only the second time I've been inside here. It does sound weird, doesn't it? But that's the truth. So everybody sit back, relax. I'll relax myself while I deliver to you a timely talk on the town clock. The clock ticks on. It has ticked on for 100 years, and we hope it will continue for another 100 years. It is Maynard's most famous landmark, known to us as the town clock. In January 1975, through a special town meeting, an official town seal featuring the clock was adopted. Very little historical data was available, and for this reason, I made an attempt to gather some interesting facts from employees of the former American Woolen Company. This story was presented as a program for the Maynard Historical Society several years ago, and the papers are stored in the files with its important and valuable printed materials. I would like to acknowledge the following people for their cooperation in helping and advising me. The late Mr. Arthur Dawson, former maintenance superintendent of the American Woolen Company. Mr. Irving Berg, resident manager of Maynard Industries. Mr. John Bottino, maintenance worker, and especially to the late Pat Murray, longtime Maynard resident and maintenance man for the mill property, who patiently and accurately answered a barrage of questions and provided statistics and descriptions. The Concord Enterprise of October 1892 provided me with some material. Although the clock has always been referred to as the town clock, Maynard could never claim its ownership. Thus, no records of it are available. The clock was a gift to the Assabet Manufacturing Company in 1892 by Lorenzo Maynard, agent for the company, in memory of his father Amory, who founded the company in 1848. In 1896, ownership was transferred to the American Woolen Company, and in 1953 to Maynard Industries Incorporated. During the summer of 1974, Digital Equipment Corporation purchased the entire mill complex, where it had rented space for 15 years. Thus, the beloved town clock is now the property of Digital. The clock tower is a complex wooden structure atop a 5-story brick base adjacent to building number 8 Annex and towering 3 stories above it. It was built by Levi Cheney, a well-known Maynard carpenter who built many sturdy homes in Maynard in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The outside of the tower was painted white with a brick red trim, and these colors were borne for 50 years until World War II. The red was overlaid with gray to make it less conspicuous from possible enemy air raids. The clock itself was made by the E. Howard Clock Company of Waltham, whose workmanship was famous for its high quality. A staging was set up and installation of the machinery was begun on October 11, 1892. The 4 faces of the clock were installed the following week, and all the staging removed on October 17th. The following charming bit of reporting appeared in the Concord Enterprise under Maynard News items on October 27, 1892. The clock, quote, "The clock on the mill tower proves to be one of the greatest conveniences in our village, and when striking can be heard at quite a distance, and the quality of the tones of the bell being rich, penetrating, and pleasant. The new dynamo for lighting the tower went into operation Monday evening, and hereafter the clock will be illuminated all night. The mill company are entitled to the thanks of all the community for this great public blessing," end quote. The stairways to the tower number 8 landings, 3 of these from the 5th floor, boast 124 steps and is 85 feet from the ground. The stairs in the main building are a normal length, but the nearer to the top, the narrower they become. The wooden tower floor is 12 feet square. Into each of the 4 corners are installed heavy iron rods which descend 2 floors down into the tower. These rods add strength to the wooden edifice and have protected it from being blown away by buffeting winds. The clock mechanism is in the middle of the tower, and extending from its center are 4 metal shafts. A small clock 9 inches in diameter is used to adjust and set the controls of the large clock, since the outside of it is not visible from the inside of the tower. There are 2 winders with cables and weights, one for the timer and one for the striker. They are wound with a crank-type handle requiring much human muscle and elbow grease. The operating machinery is an 8-day mechanism, so must be wound every week. 90 turns of the crank are required to wind the timer, and 330 to wind the striker. The complete winding job takes an hour and a half. The clock faces are 9 feet in diameter, and the sides of the tower are 12 feet wide. Behind each face is a metal shield, 8 feet in diameter, and 3.5 feet from each face. These shields hold 5 60-watt bulbs each and furnish the light for each of the clock faces. Originally, power for the clock lights was operated by the water wheel, which generated 40 cycles. When the tower was converted to 60 cycles in 1929, the clock lights were not converted and continued to be lighted by the water power until the floods of Hurricane Diane in 1957 inflicted devastating damage to many of the first-floor mill buildings. Much rewiring was necessary. It was at this time that the clock lights were converted to 60 cycles. The clock bell was 40 feet from the clock and 6 feet high and 6 feet in diameter. The clock hands are 40 inches and 54.5 inches long, made of lightweight, durable balsa wood. The original hands were replaced a few years ago when the clock tower was refurbished and are now securely in the hands of the archives of the Maynard Historical Society. So, this is the story of the town clock. No matter who owns it, cares for it, perhaps even destroys it, it will affectionately be Maynard's town clock. Long may it tick.
Thank you, Mrs. Schneer. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Mr. Dana Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell attended local schools where he grew up in Naugatuck, Connecticut, and I was chatting with him earlier this evening, and that's 25 or 30 miles from where Ken Olson came from down in Stratford, Connecticut. Mr. Blackwell attended local schools where he grew up there and attended Monson Academy, then Tufts University. He taught mathematics, Latin, English, and German for 10 years, then spent 25 years in engineering designing aircraft instrument systems, a field in which he holds a number of patents. Since his retirement from engineering, he has served as chief engineer and vice president of the E. Howard Clock Company and as curator and horological consultant to the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, Connecticut. During this period, he has restored over 400 clocks. He has served as president and since retiring serves on the board of directors of the museum. Mr. Blackwell has also been first vice president of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors and a member of the Antiquarian Horological Society of Great Britain. With those qualifications, I'm certainly looking forward to your remarks, sir. Please welcome Mr. Dana Blackwell.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCain. It's certainly a privilege for me to be here and to celebrate this momentous occasion with you. You're not alone in cherishing your local town clock. There are many towns that have had great interest developed in recent years. In fact, when I was at the factory in 1976, I received a number of calls of people, of towns that had town clocks, but they had been neglected, mainly because someone was too lazy to wind them, and they decided they weren't necessary really anymore. But all of a sudden, with the bicentennial, they became very interested and wanted to know if we could ship them great wheels and all kinds of stuff. They thought this was off-the-shelf material. And of course, every tower clock that Howard made was made to order, since the customer had to provide the size of the tower, the number of dials, the diameter of the dials, the size of the bell, all this sort of thing in order to produce the right movement. And town clocks have played a very important part in many communities because well, I guess quite a few years ago, it doesn't seem that long to me, but there was a day when there were no radios, no telephone time service. If you wanted to set your watch, you might have quite a problem. Usually you went to the local jeweler who had some regulator in the window that was sort of the time standard. It is said in one town, a man asked how they set the town clock. And the custodian said, well, we use Mr. So-and-so's clock in his jewelry store window. So he went and asked the jeweler what he used for his time standard, and he said, well, I set it by the town clock. I've put together some slides here to give you some background about this sort of thing, And I think the pictures are worth more than words, so if we may have those now, why. This begins back in the early days of man before he didn't worry about the time. His stomach told him when it was time to eat. When the sun went down, it was time to retire. When it rose, it was time to get up. However, as man became more observant of his surroundings, he noticed that a monolith or a post or a tree cast a shadow, and that as the sun appeared to traverse the heavens, the shadow moved along. And of course, eventually this led to the development of the sundial. Now, we don't know when the first sundial was used. You do? Okay, well, okay. This, all, of course, written language was a rather recent development as far as the history of man is concerned. And so written records were not too common, and often they were not well preserved. But the first records we have of timekeepers as such are the Dial of Ahaz. King Ahaz was a king reigning in Israel about 700 BC, and in the second book of Kings it mentions his dial and the sun going back so many steps. And of course the sundial has persisted through the years, more decoratively now than functionally, but this is a sundial that was put in at Corpus Christi College in Oxford back in the 1600s, and it was duplicated at Princeton University as a gift later on. Now, of course, sundials are no use if you don't have the sun out, or a cloudy day, or at night. So people who were ingenious developed things like this kind of a clock, which was a lamp with a reservoir, and it scribed numerals on the scale there, and as the oil burned down, it told you what time it was. Of course, if the wick was high, the hours went faster. If it was low, they were slower. It wasn't awfully reliable. And eventually, water was used extensively, probably in Alexandria in Egypt, which was an important university center in ancient times. And if you remember your first year Greek, this is called a clepsydra, that is a stealer of water. It's a complicated one. The early ones were simply just had a vessel with a little hole and the water ran out. But this one was to be more, provide a more consistent flow. Then, of course, once they could blow glass, as they did in Venice, so that's where glass blowing really developed, they were able to take and blow two bulbs, put them together with a little plate with an orifice, and put sand in it and count the hours or fractions of hours by that means. This is Salisbury Cathedral in England. There are, of course, many great cathedrals in Europe. Some of them took centuries to build. This one is sort of unusual in that it was all built in about 60 years. So it's all the same style. It didn't go through all the style changes. It was finished in the around 1260, and it's pointed Gothic, obviously. And it had a clock. And the clock was in the tower. Didn't have any dial. See, clock is a Gothic word meaning bell. And a clock was a device to sound a bell automatically. And the reason this came about in cathedrals was that when Pope Gregory the Great died in 604, he had a scheme to tidy up the liturgy and have certain portions of it used at specified times. This got monks, Gregory didn't implement that himself. He had this idea, and it was left for his successor, Sabinianus, who reigned 2 years to promulgate the bull pertaining to that. But that got monks, who were then the learned people, to think about timekeeping. And we used to think Gerbert, a monk in Magdeburg, Germany, who became Pope Sylvester II, invented the clock, because it says there was a horologium in Magdeburg in 996. However, the modern scholarship has shown that horologium can mean a sundial, a clepsydra, a mechanical clock, or anything. So it's thought to be that probably it was not developed before, maybe 1050, something like that. But this is an interesting clock. This was lost. It was in this building from the time it was built until around 1880. Then it disappeared, and nobody could tell where it was. Finally, it was found by a man named Robinson, I think around 1930s, and resurrected. It was dragged out of a storeroom where it had been hidden. It was refurbished. It was put up in the nave, and it's made of wrought iron. It dates back to the 1200s. This front wheel is the count wheel that counts the number of strokes when the hours are sounded. And it is still running and is the oldest running clock known today. This clock was controlled by what's called a folio, that bar across the top with the weights on it. And that moved parallel to the Earth's surface in this manner. And you moved the weights in to make it go faster and out to make it go slower. But gravity did not influence, so as a result, it was affected by friction. It was not a good timekeeper. If it kept within an hour a day, it was passable. If it kept within half an hour a day, it was considered quite remarkable. Later on, something happened. This is just, I don't know if you can see that. That's a diagram of how it is propelled by pallets above and below, and that crown wheel alternately gives it a pulse to keep it moving. It so happens one day Galileo, who was one of those great Renaissance men who was at home in many fields and had a very active mind, he was sitting in Pisa Cathedral, and the transept doors were open and the breeze was blowing through and the vigil lamp in front of the high altar was swinging, and suddenly he perceived something. It didn't seem to matter whether it was a big arc or a small one. It seemed to take the same period of time. And this excited him. He didn't know how to measure this, so he used his pulse beats. That wasn't very effective, very accurate, because he was quite excited anyway, so they weren't too steady. But anyway, he thought this might have some use. This was in 1657. And this idea eventually found its way through communication. In those days, the learned men in Europe communicated in long Latin epistles. And this idea got to Christian Huygens, the famous Dutch philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, etc., etc. And he took a clock with a folio, and he went to Solomon Coster, a clockmaker at The Hague, and he said, turn this device 90 degrees, take off the upper weight, so now you have a pendulous action, which of course gravity influences, and see what happens. Well, with some modification, they found the clock kept within a minute a day, and that revolutionized the trade, and the Fromentil family got wind of this, and they transmitted the idea from Holland to their relatives in England, and that became the center of high-grade clockmaking for a long, long time. This simply shows the Galilean principle of the pendulum swinging. I won't get into the theory of the isochronism of it, but that led to the building of many more important clocks, particularly in important cities. This is the famous clock in Venice. It's still functioning. This dates back to the 1500s. It has a 24-hour dial. Of course, when you look at a clock, you often don't stop and think about what is behind it. I tell people, you know, clocks are very much like human beings. There's more behind the face than meets the eye. When you look at a clock face as the one up there on the wall, that's not a clock really, that's a timepiece, it doesn't strike, but that has Arabic numerals, and we owe that to the ancient Arabians, who were the great masters of mathematics and astronomy in the early days. In fact, they'd calculated the circumference of the Earth in about 900 to an accuracy never excelled until the end of the 19th century, whereas it took Europe about 500 years to make up their mind the Earth wasn't flat. But anyway, this is a rather complicated clock, as many of these were, because they were important central features of big cities. So it has calendar work. It used to be called, its nickname was the Murderer. And that's because the two jacks that strike the hours and quarters at the top once caused a difficulty. A man was standing there when one of them came back with his arm and knocked him down into the courtyard below, and as you know, that has some rather solid tiles. So he didn't survive to tell the story. But throughout Europe, clocks became important. This is St. Stephen's in Vienna. You shouldn't worry about the few steps you have up to this tower. I climbed that tower, at least I climbed 537 steps, I believe it was. That takes a little time. But that was the center of the city. In fact, all the streets radiated out in the old days and were numbered from the cathedral. And the cathedral was, of course, the center of not only religious activity, but much of the rest of the community life. And on the front of that, there was a clock installed. And that cathedral goes back to the 1200s, although it was damaged in World War II somewhat and has had to have some restoration. And then this church in front is St. Peter's Church in Vienna, for which, of course, Mozart wrote a lot of his liturgical music. And this is the monastery out at Melk, where there are clocks in each tower. I don't know if one is checking on the other or what, but that's a magnificent Benedictine abbey of the 1700s. This is one of the famous clocks in Bern, Switzerland. See, cities throughout Europe, once clocks were made that would keep reasonably good time, wanted an important clock to provide time for the community, because they were becoming more time conscious as crafts developed. Of course, this is long before the Industrial Revolution. That one dates from about 1550. It originally just had one hand. All the early ones just had a single hand pointing to the hour. You interpolated in between. And this one has figures that perform on the hour. Many of these European clocks are quite complicated. And this is the opposite side. And you see there some religious figures, because people used to associate time with religion. You know, they grew up thinking you must give an account for every moment you spend on this earthly pilgrimage, and therefore you should give every flying minute something to keep in store. Work, for the night is coming when man works no more. So that many clocks, old ones, have that type of feature. Now, in America, of course, in the early days, our brass and metals for processing came mainly from Britain. But the Yankees in Connecticut, they utilized wood, which had also been used in the Black Forest in Germany. This just shows a tower clock by Samuel Terry, Eli Terry's brother. This was made for a church in Bristol in 1832. And it functioned until the 1920s. But then the wheelwork behind the dial had rotted, and rather than replacing that, they replaced the whole clock, but saved this part of it, and it's still running at the museum. So these things have a long life, even when made of wood. Now, the Howard Company, who made your clock, was established in 1842. Edward Howard was an apprentice to Aaron Willard, Jr. And this is the oldest ad I know of, or trade card. This was mounted beside a clock they installed in the 1840s, and they advertised that they make house clocks and various kinds, and tower clocks too. And the oldest running one I know of is one in New Hampshire of 1844, but this one I don't believe exists now. And this is a big broadside they published back in those days. This is about 1846, I think. Where they showed different types of things they made, including a big tower clock at the top there. They also made scales for stores and for banks, because in those days many transactions were in gold, and they made the U.S. standard gold balance that was approved by the government. This is just a store scale, but this is a U.S. standard gold bullion balance for a bank, since in those days, many people wanted to transact things in gold because they had more confidence in it than money. I mean, paper money, you know. Sometimes I wish we still operated that way. This just shows the nice engraving. They were hand engraved on the front, explaining what they were and so forth. They made regulators, that is, precision clocks for jewelers to regulate their clocks by, and those often were town standards. This is one like one on that placard. This one was made in 1850 for a jeweler in New Hampshire, in Dover, New Hampshire. This is one they made for the the railroad station of the Fitchburg Railroad in Boston in 1857, and that was the one used to dispatch the trains. They also advertised, of course, from time to time their various things, and Howard was a great one for diversification. It is said he was the first person to make baby food in cans. Well, I don't know much about that venture. I don't think it was too successful, but he did want to make fire engines and locomotives. They never did get into the locomotives, but they did make fire engines. Now, this is a mill, not your mill. This is the Amoskeag Mill up in New Hampshire, and this was the pay office, and you can see a banjo clock there in the background, which Howard supplied them. The mills were great customers of Howard's because they provided the office clocks, and in some cases tower clocks on some of the larger ones. And this is an award they got in 1855 for an exhibit of some of the products they had made. When we used to have government inspectors come to Howard to discuss, government contracts of fuse parts and things, I used to point that out and say, well, you can be sure our quality is fine because here's a nice award from 1855, but that didn't carry a lot of weight with government inspectors. And many medals were awarded, and they made a tremendous variety of clocks for offices, schools, and these are some we were making when I was there, and they're old models. This is one in Faneuil Hall in Boston, which is still functioning. It was made by them in 1849 or 50, I've forgotten which. And it has a wooden dial about, probably 4 feet in diameter, made from one piece of wood, which is never warped. It was installed there in 1850, or 51, I guess it is. It was given by the school children of Boston. They took up a collection. And I used to take care of it, but I'm not near Boston now, so I don't know who handles it, but it's a rather interesting one that has survived well. Here's one they made for an insurance company in Hartford in 1872, and it's quite a magnificent one. And this is the way they kept the records. There are a lot of bound books, and these books are kind of interesting. I used to correspond with a man in New Hampshire who worked for Howard and said the happiest days he ever spent were when he worked at the Howard Clock Company. And I looked him up, and he had come there in 1896. He retired in 1934, and I found out that when he started, he worked 60 hours a week for $3, I think it was, and $3.59 or something for the week. He'd gone up to $5 in a couple of years, but those dollars were, of course, a little different from ours. This one was one made for the Mechanics Bank in Boston with the state seal of Massachusetts on it, and that had been dumped in a basement of the bank, and, well, we won't go into the mechanism. Of course, many of these clocks, these precision ones, had mercury pendulums. That is, it was discovered that when the pendulum expanded, the clock lost time. When it contracted, it gained because it was getting longer or shorter. And George Graham in England in 1716 conceived the idea of using mercury to expand up as the rod expanded down. And since you could work out an easy relationship here, the ratio of most steel was such that 7 inches of mercury would pretty well compensate. Then the actual compensation was conducted in ovens at different temperatures. The railroads, of course, required many clocks, so most of the railroad stations who were supposed to operate on schedule, in the old days did pretty well, wanted a tower clock and a precision clock in the railroad. Now, if you were very wealthy in 1745, you might have owned this clock. This clock is a English bracket clock made in London, which has a cord hanging out the side. If you want the time in the dark, you reach out and pull the cord, and it strikes on 6 bells the number of the quarter, and then it strikes the hour afterwards. So you can get it to within 15 minutes very easily, which saved a lot of time, because if you woke up at 2 o'clock and had insomnia and wanted the time, and you didn't have something like this, you'd have to fumble around for your tinder box, get a nice spark, light your tinder, light your candle, look at your timepiece. This was much more convenient, but many times as expensive. This is one of my favorite clocks. Your clock has served 100 years, and that's pretty good, and it will serve several hundred more if maintained. This one is one I wind on Saturdays in my house, which was made in 1680. And this is the back of it. It's quite elegantly engraved. And as I often wind it, I wonder how many things are being made today that still will serve their original purpose 300 years from now. I don't think too many. They become obsolete too fast today. This is Edward Howard, who founded the company in 1842, typical Yankee from Hingham, Massachusetts. And this is the Air Mill clock. That's another clock that has considerable attention. The Air Mill up in Lawrence built the biggest Howard Tower clock, had the biggest Howard Tower clock they ever built. In fact, the picture of the opening for the dials, they're 22.5-foot dials. They took the picture of the workmen who worked on it, and there are, I believe, something like 20 men or 22 men in the dial. So you can see it's a pretty big one. That one fell into terrible disrepair. The man who owned the mill threatened to shoot anybody who wanted to go up there and see it. But since then, Lawrence has raised money, a tremendous amount of money, to redo that tower. The only thing is they forgot to fix the roof before they fixed the clock, so it rain leaked on. This is the Howard factory where the clock was made. Your clock was made up on the fourth floor of that building. They never had an elevator there until 1924. I don't know how they lugged all that stuff up and down. And this is what a tower clock movement looks like. This happens to be an early one. This is a little bigger one with striking mechanism and so forth. They made them in many sizes, 5 sort of standardized sizes, and then all sorts of variations. This is one that chimes the quarters on big bells. That is one of the biggest types they did make. And here is one at the museum in Bristol still functioning. This is a rather small one. We don't operate the chimes because if you have 4 big bells sound the quarters inside a building, it is rather disturbing. We have just one tower. We have a number of tower clocks running, but only one that strikes on a fair-sized bell. And that's interesting to watch on the hour if people are in the neighborhood, because the bell's inside and some of them come right up off the floor. This is what, in the heyday of the tower clock, clocks ready for shipment looked like. Howard ceased to make tower clocks in 1963. The last one they made was for a competitor, IBM. They had a very funny order. They wanted this clock to operate by a synchronous motor or weight-driven pendulum control that you could just shift from one to the other. I don't quite know what the use was. This is a big timepiece, just no striking. Many of these clocks were equipped with this kind of a device, a wheel that went around once every 24 hours. And you could unscrew those things and locate them in such a way that they would operate a lever that opened and closed a gas valve. This was for a gas-lighted tower clock, and Howard still made those up to about 1923. There were some public buildings still gas-lighted at that time. And then, of course, when electricity became common, they simply changed this to operate switches on and off, depending on the length of the day. That's just another one. This is one in the Pullman factory office out in Illinois, the Pullman parlor car company. That was put up in 1880. That fell into disrepair. This is the movement, beautifully restored by a man in Chicago, and that has that 24-hour wheel. And this is the way a tower clock is mounted in a tower. It can be on the level of the dials, above the dials, below the dials. The bell may be above or below, and it's necessary to know all that sort of thing, how it's to be put in there before the thing is made up. And this just shows different arrangements with the movement. First one here is the bell above. Well, the bell is above in most of those, I guess. But it can be arranged different ways depending on how the tower is. The same type of movement, but much smaller, was used in post clocks on the street in front of jewelry stores. This is one made in 1881 for a building in Springfield, Massachusetts, and now it's the museum at the museum in Bristol, Connecticut. This is one made in the form of a watch. They used to make these up to special order if somebody wanted something unique. This one used to be in Boston, in front of Montgomery Frost, the opticians, and that also had the weather for the day and the temperature and all that. It got knocked down by a truck. Some of these had contacts on them that would operate other clocks, electrical clocks around the building. Howard was the first to make electric clocks in America. They supplied the State House in Hartford, Connecticut in 1878, and the same year the City Hall in Providence, Rhode Island. And then they had big systems where that wall clock controlled hundreds of clocks in a big insurance building in New York. They also made locks for timers for bank vault locks. These are clocks of an old style that was introduced in the 1850s, but we brought it back some years ago, and it proved to be fairly popular, and also in Vienna style. And they also made many watch clocks to check up on watchmen to be sure they made their rounds. Now this is usually done with little Detex things that the watchman carries around. But in the old days, he used to go around and crank these up, and it would record on a dial there that he had made his rounds. Now, that's just some price list, not consequence. This just gives us some statistics. That's prices of clocks. That's in 1890, about the same time your clock was put in, depending on number of dials and so forth, whether it struck or didn't strike and such. Again, not our dollars. Here is one. After electric motors came in, it was possible to make motors to automatically wind the clock. Every time the weights got down a certain distance, they would put a switch on, and then they would be rewound. Here are some statistics. In 105 years, that is by 1960, they had produced 3,995 clocks, of which, well, in 1890, 250 were in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the best customer because it was close at hand, although they supplied them all over the country and to India and Russia and a few other places. They did actually make over 4,000. And there was enough interest in these in 1976, so the Smithsonian asked me if I would lend them some of my Howards that they could exhibit for a year. And I said, sure, that's all right. Come up and pick out what you want. So they did. However, I found they were a little difficult because after a year they wanted them another year, and then they wanted them 2 more, and they finally kept them 17 years, and I finally got a little irritated and said send them back because they asked me if I wouldn't want to give them to them. But I was a little irritated by the fact that they had decided to adopt the politically correct concept and are going through changing their exhibits to make them politically correct. I don't know how you correct clocks for political purposes, but anyway. Of course, Howard wasn't the only one that made tower clocks. Seth Thomas was their big competitor. They didn't get into it so early, but they made quite a few. This is one for Independence Hall. And in late years, even, we had some special clocks. This was one we designed for the bicentennial in 1976. We made about 150 of these. With the 13 states on the front and so forth. Well, you have a possession in Maynard which is of significance. A clock of this sort can last for hundreds of years if it is kept in reasonably clean and properly lubricated condition. Granted, we don't need such things today. You can get the time, over the radio or TV or what have you. But a clock is a kind of living being. Its ticking is almost like the pulse beats of a heart, and it certainly is a treasure for any town who has one, and many towns bought tower clocks and put them in the church that had the highest tower or the most convenient location. This one was acquired by a mill because, probably because as many mills felt, they liked to have the workers get to work on time. And even when I went to school, kids would be late and say, well, our clock was wrong. This is before electric, synchronous electric clocks. But the mills had big bells so that the people would hear 6 o'clock in the morning and it was time to get up and think about getting to work. So that it wasn't just a sense of benevolence, but also a real sense of usefulness. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to share some ideas with you.
A sincere thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Very entertaining. I'd like now to ask Ralph Sheridan if he would come to the podium, please. And while he's doing that, to extend a welcome this evening. Mr. Sheridan, as I suspect almost everyone in the room knows, was born in Maynard, and except for time in the armed services, has lived here all his life. As town historian, he has dedicated himself to the preservation of town artifacts and has chronicled the history of the mill and the businesses that have employed hundreds, perhaps thousands of residents here over the year. What I would like to do now, Mr. Sheridan, we at Digital are happy to present to you and to the town of Maynard this plaque commemorating the centennial anniversary of the installation of the mill clock. And I'd like to read the inscription. The mill clock, in commemoration of 100 years of service to employees and community, October 21st, 1892, 1992.
One little correction. I wasn't in the military service. I worked during the World War I in the Navy Department of Washington, D.C. I was in the civilian service. No harm done, but I don't want to give the idea somewhere I was hiding something about being a veteran and hiding it. But I am deeply honored to have been selected to accept this plaque on behalf of the town of Maynard. I'm sure the citizens of the town will make sure to have it posted in an appropriate place so that people can cherish it. I certainly cherish the clock and anything connected with it. As you all know, I was born in the shadow of the clock, and not too many years after the clock was erected. Probably the mortar wasn't even dry in the bricks probably when I came in town. But anyway, for all my life, except the time I was working in Washington during the World War I have lived in the same shadow, I believe, or the shadow of the clock. I have looked at it many times. Naturally, I probably more than most people are sitting in this hall tonight. But to me, the clock means a lot. To me, it's like a part of the family, like a big brother, so to speak, because the clock and I are actually holdovers from the last century. And together, I would say, we both, with the grace of God, we have worn well. And I would say, now with the digital in charge here and so forth, I think under their watchful eye, that they will certainly make sure that the clock will be worn well for the next 100 years. Thank you.
When Digital acquired the mill from Maynard Industries in 1974, the clock very quickly became part of the Digital culture. Recognizing its historical significance to the town, Digital was pleased to undertake its restoration in 1980. As we look to the new century, we will continue to value its special place in Maynard and atop Digital's corporate headquarters. And I have been told that we are committed to not doing the electrification, that we will continue to wind it by hand each week as it has been for 100 years. We have a short film on the mill clock produced by Henry Walsh and Nick Ugrano from Digital's Maynard Area Engineering Training Group. Nick and Henry take you up to the clock to see it close hand striking 12 noon. Then, for those of you who feel ambitious and energetic and would like to climb the stairs for a tour of the mill clock tower, Digital tour guides will be offering tours this evening, as well as continuing the tours open to the public tomorrow evening from 6 to 7:30 p.m. We'd like to again express our appreciation to all of you for joining us here this evening. I'll say good night now, and we'll roll the film. Thank you.